Okay.
Now, Professor Rees, you are, of course, famous as one of the co-creators of the ecological footprint concept. Could you please tell us the story of how this concept and this term came into being?
Well, it really began when I was a youngster. I was privileged, as few urban kids are today, to have spent a great deal of time on my grandparents' farm in southern Ontario. In fact, through the late 1940s and 1950s, I was among 8 cousins who were, farm laborers, basically, doing everything that one did on a dirt farm in those days. Initially, we didn't have a tractor, electricity came late, and so on. So I've done everything from milking cows to hand-loading hay onto a horse-drawn wagon in my youth. And we used to meet, of course, every day at lunch and dinner, big farm lunches and so on. And one day, I guess I was about 10 years old, in my grandmother's big country porch, a whole crowd of us around the table. We were waiting for my grandfather to come in from the washroom to say grace, and I was just staring idly at my plate. We were allowed to fill up, but not to eat until he sat down. And it struck me as a 10-year-old, as I looked at my plate, that I had had something to do. I had a hand in growing every single thing on that plate. And as that idea sort of came to consciousness, I felt as if the chair had been pulled out from under me. I was in an elevator in free fall, is how I once described it. And feeling this inordinate sense of connection to the earth, because it was through my labor that the food was produced by the earth and then converted into me. Well, I was an immature youngster, and that's as far as it went. But years later, when I had an opportunity to go to university, this image came back to me, and I knew I had to become an ecologist. And years later, I had to convert or translate that idea into a simple question. How much of the Earth's surface is needed to support just me in the lifestyle to which I had at that time become accustomed? And it wasn't until I joined the School of Planning at UBC that I was stimulated to really develop that idea by economists who kept telling me there were no limits to growth, that the economy was decoupling from nature, that humans were now independent of any natural constraints. This is in the early 1970s. And the idea bothered me enormously as an ecologist, because I just couldn't understand how anyone could think humans did not still depend to some degree on nature. And of course, the way out of this dilemma, they defined carrying capacity the way ecologists had, as the number of people living in a particular area, or the number of organisms that could be sustained by a particular area without destroying the habitat. That's what carrying capacity is all about. But as they pointed out, if you can trade and bring in resources from elsewhere, there's no reason for a regional population to be restrained by its local resource base. So there's a few other details, but to their minds, this essentially eliminated any concerns about carrying capacity for humans, because each nation can trade with every other to relieve its own local constraints. I realized some years, not years, maybe 2 or 3 years later, that if I turned over the carrying capacity ratio, I could answer my old question. So instead of asking how many people per unit area, you ask how much area is needed to support this population, wherever that area is. So the simple reality is that trade is the appropriation of carrying capacity from other places used to support a population in this place. So it's true that that population seems to have been relieved of any constraints on local productive capacity, but they're doing it by drawing down capacity elsewhere. So when Matthijs Wackernagel came around, he's the now president of the Global Footprint Forum, we formalized this concept and began to develop a method whereby we could measure my old question, how much area of the earth is needed to support just me? So an individual or a city's ecological footprint or a nation's ecological footprint is defined the same way. It's the area of productive land and water ecosystems required to produce the resources that that population consumes and to assimilate the wastes that that population produces wherever on Earth those ecosystems may be. So the U.S. ecological footprint is all over the planet in those countries from which it imports goods. And of course other countries have a huge eco footprint on the U.S. or Canada and so on and so forth. So right now, through trade, we have an increasingly, and I would say increasingly unsustainable entanglement of nations as each country expands beyond its local or domestic carrying capacity and appropriates reserves and surpluses that are still available in the global commons or in other countries.
So the ecological footprint idea, the term, when did it really take off internationally? When did everybody start talking about it?
I guess it took off with the publication of our little book called Our Ecological Footprint, Reducing Human Impact on Earth. And that was, I think, 1996. So from that point on, it's amazing the degree to which the term went viral, to use the current jargon. The book's been translated into 8 or 9 other languages. It's available in China, for example, and I travel there from time to time. And in one stop, I was almost greeted as a rock star. There was quite a crowd at the airport of students from the university who had read the book in Chinese and were familiar with the concept. So you see, there's real power in a metaphor. And the ecological footprint is something that most people in most countries can grasp immediately. We did explicitly wanted to connect people to their own impacts on the planet, very personally, through consumption. Everybody's a consumer. You cannot not be a consumer. So it's not about making people guilty. It's just raising to consciousness that the act of consumption implies some impact on the place of production. The second thing was to tie it to something that had a meaning to everyone and which was limited, and land is the key here. So there's only so much land, there's only so much productive ocean. It's not growing, it's a fixed quantity. And once people began to realize that there's only so many footprints that can be put out on that land and water, and that we're in competition with each other for the available limited capacity, I think the power of that metaphor takes off. And now I think it's probably fair to say that the ecological footprint, certainly at the popular level, is the most commonly known of all the indicators of sustainability.
Gosh, how does it feel to have been, instrumental in that?
Well, it's said, I guess, that everyone has one good idea, and I guess this was my good idea. But I give full credit to Matisse Wackernagel and other students of mine all over the world. Yoshi Wada in Japan has had an enormous influence on Japanese thinking. Peter Teibner is at Dalhousie University. I've had a number of wonderful students who've helped to promote this idea. Matisse stands out among them, of course, as the creator with his wife of the Global Footprint Network. And they've done just a marvelous job in helping to popularize the idea. And I still work on one of the committees to standardize the method and make sure that it gains in credibility around the world. So it's spreading, it's becoming increasingly credible, the methods are increasingly rigorous and recognized by more and more agencies. So I think we have a really good chance here in changing people's perception of their relationship to the ecosphere.